Well, welcome again, everyone, to today's episode of Resilient Health Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Darin Ingels, and joining me on the podcast today is Elizabeth Yarnell. She is a traditional naturopath and nutritionist and expert in inflammation, and I come just to recently learn a fellow MS warrior. So, Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Hi, Dr. Darin. It's so great to be on here with you today, and I'm really excited for our topic.
Well, we were talking a little bit before we started recording here. We both just realized that we both have MS and have kind of been through that journey. Can you just share a little bit about kind of your experience and how things manifested with you?
For me, it all began one night in 1999. So I've been at this for quite some time. And I was up late in my apartment working on an article for the Denver Post. And I had completed what I felt was maybe the penultimate draft. And it was late, and I sent it off to my inkjet printer, and I pulled out the pages, and I was kind of scanning them as I was brushing my teeth. But I was tired and I wanted to go to sleep. And I spotted there were three edits that I thought I wanted to make in the morning before I turned it in to my editor. And I went to sleep. And when I woke up the next morning and I set the pages down on my kitchen table with my cup of coffee, I couldn't read the pages anymore. It was almost like somebody had come and erased big swaths of text on the paper, or that clouds were coming in front of my eyes. I just couldn't read it. And what I could read, I really wasn't making any sense to me, even though it had only been a couple hours since I had written those words. And in short order, I was off to the eye doctor, and the eye doctor sent me off for an MRI. And that's when I discovered that I had multiple sclerosis. So my originating experience was diagnosed as optic neuritis, which is
Uh-huh.
inflammation of the optic nerve, very, very common for multiple sclerosis. It is inflammation that blocks the information that's coming in from your eyes to your brain, where it can decipher what you're seeing. And it very common form of inflammation for MS. And for me, that was a life-changing event. I was a freelance journalist, and I had to really reckon with the idea, if I can't see and I can't read and I can't write, how am I going to support myself? I'm going to have to create a whole new career, a whole new life. I really was, this was back in the days before really the beginning of the internet, before the World Wide
Right.
Web, really. And there really wasn't that much information. What really stuck with me from my MS doctors was that I would be probably in a wheelchair within 10 years of diagnosis. That was the stat was 80% of MS patients are in a wheelchair, whether or not you took one of the drugs that were then available. At that time, there were three drugs available. They were all injectable. I had tremendous needle phobia. I managed to traumatize myself every single day to do this injection, but it wasn't helping. And in fact, it seemed to be harming me. I was having terrible, terrible side effects. I had hives covering my entire body for 3 years, nonstop, every single day. A good day was 30 hives. A bad day was 300 hives. By the time I stopped with the drug, I was having a seizure every time I injected the needle.
Oh, wow.
So my body was really telling me that this was not the right direction for me. On top of it, even though I was taking the drug, which still to this day, all of these MS drugs have very low efficacy rates, well under 50%. And I was still having MS exacerbations at the rate of more than one a year, serious exacerbations. So there really didn't seem to me to be any valid reason for me to continue to take that drug. So I stopped taking any drugs in 2004 and really dedicated my life to trying to figure out, well, what could I do to help myself feel better? Because at the end of the day, it's me that matters the most to, right?
Right.
My doctors are very kind, they're very concerned, but it's me. This is my life and my future. And I really didn't want to spend it in a wheelchair. that wasn't in my future plans. I had recently gotten married. I had completed graduate school, all of these things that were moving forward in my life until this huge roadblock came around. So I thought, well, what can I do to make my life better? And I asked my MS doctor and I said, well, what if I change my diet? What if I change my lifestyle? And what if I exercise my body and my brain? And my doctor said, yeah, no, that's all nice, but that's not going to change anything. And I can't even tell you, like now, here I am 27 years past that doctor's visit, and I wish I could just slap him across the face because he couldn't have been more wrong
Right.
about how you can influence the course of your life and your own disease. And that's when I began to first started researching into what is a healthy diet, because at that time, the staple foods I kept in my apartment were Crystal Light Diet Coke and gummy bears. So I really wasn't doing my body any favors with my diet, and I didn't really know what a healthy diet was. And so there was all these fad diets going around. There was Atkins and South Beach and all of this stuff. But I didn't want a fad diet. I wanted to be healthy. I wanted to give my body the nutrition it needed. I wanted to uh, help it for the nervous system to actually communicate the messages to my body that my body needed to function and work correctly. And really, there wasn't a lot of information out there. I studied from the Mayo Clinic and all sorts of respected health authorities. And really, what I came out with was that what became my mantra, which is whole foods are better than processed foods. And that what I have learned, especially in the intervening 2 or 3 decades, is how contaminated our food supply really is. All of our processed foods are full of all of these additives and preservatives, most of which are not even allowed in the European Union, most of which have never been tested as safe for human consumption. They fall under this FDA loophole called GRAS, GRAS, generally recognized as safe. But that's all what the company can say. The company can say, oh, we think this is safe. And no one is monitoring the amounts that we're getting in our food supply, which is increasing every year. And the long-term effects of all of these really petrochemicals and other artificially created additives and preservatives that are in our food supply. In fact, I gave a TED talk in 2014 called Poisons in Our Everyday Foods. And when I gave it, I had to lobby the TED.com company to actually post it because they thought it was too controversial, that
Yeah.
they didn't. And they finally agreed, after 6 months of lobbying, they finally agreed to post it if they could put a banner up that said, TED does not endorse what this talk says. And I said, please just put it up there and I will take that banner as a badge of honor, because what we have come to see in the intervening 15 years is even worse than we thought it would be.
Well, it's interesting, in talking with Dr. Terry Walls, who's a MS warrior researcher, and I know she had a similar experience that when she first started coming out saying, "Hey, diet makes a difference." The MS Society ignored her. Now they want her to speak at their conferences, but there was this really interesting kind of backlash against recognizing that what you put in your mouth could actually have an impact on MS. And of course, I think we can look more broad across really any autoimmune disease. The role between your gut and your brain, your gut and your other tissues. Your microbiome is just so critically important for governing so much of how your immune system reacts, and certainly what drives a lot of that autoimmune process. Uh, Obviously what you put in your mouth affects the gut. So how there can be this disconnect in the medical community between diet and gut health, and certainly diet and inflammation, it's always been a little bit perplexing to me. Never made sense.
It blows my mind. I have clients who come into my clinic called the Inflammation Academy, and they say, oh, I have IBS. And basically, the doctor says I can take this drug, but there's really nothing I can do about it. And I asked them, I said, well, what did the doctor say about what you're eating? And they say, well, they didn't even ask me what I ate.
I can remember meeting with the gastroenterologist. I saw for myself. I had a colonoscopy many years ago, and I knew what the answer was going to be, but I asked him anyway. And this is a conventional gastroenterologist. And I said, "Well, what do you think about, how much diet is impacting, the patients you see in gut health?" And he's like, "Well, outside of celiac disease, I don't think it's really a big deal." Oh, okay.
Right,
So, even
right.
the gut experts, now again, this is some time ago, maybe that's changed, but I think my experience is still that, the conventional medical community still doesn't really acknowledge how, nutrition, the quality of our food, things we put in our mouth is driving a lot of chronic illness. And the fact that the United States, we are the sickest industrialized country in the world, should be raising red flags in every public health agency across the country. And yet, I mean, we're starting to see, I'll say, a little bit of movement. I know RFK Jr. has offered, some financial incentives to medical schools to start teaching nutrition finally, because most of them teach very little of that. So, we might start seeing some progress in that area. But yeah, there's been a really big disconnect in the medical community as a whole on the role of food quality diet and how much it's driving MS and other chronic illnesses.
Yes. In fact, a huge turning point for me was reading an article in Scientific American. It was back in the early 2000s, written by Dr. Alessio Fasano. He's
Mhm.
really the father of celiac disease, right?
Yeah.
So he was the one who first made that connection to the connection between gluten or wheat and celiac disease. And when he first presented this finding to the medical community, he was basically laughed off the stage. They really didn't believe that could be any connection between what you eat and how your body felt and functioned. And now we've kind of come around where now that's all people will say. Oh, it must be wheat. Well, I do food sensitivity testing in my clinic, and what I find out is it's never only wheat. It
Right.
may also be wheat, but it's never only wheat. Lots of things can cause your body to have hypersensitivity reactions that can impact how you feel and function. For instance, for me, one of my most reactive foods is lettuce. And you and I had talked about drop foot, which is a not uncommon symptom of multiple sclerosis. And it basically means that you lose the ability to hold the front of your foot up, your toes up as you take a
Yeah.
step. So you kind of drag it around and that makes you trip. Well, when I eat lettuce, drop foot is the symptom that I experience. But if I don't eat lettuce, then I don't experience that. So I really can see in my own self the very direct connection between what I eat and how I feel. And it's not only meat.
So, along the lines, obviously, we're both people living with MS, but, what are the big things that you're seeing are drivers of inflammation? And we talked a little bit about, diet, gut health. Are there other factors that people really should be looking at in their world that might be causing more inflammation in their body?
I think hidden parasitic infection is much more common than we have been led to believe in our medical world. I think a lot of people have parasites and they never knew it. They don't realize it. They might have been carrying them for decades. It's much easier to pick up parasites than we might realize. You can get them from swimming in a lake, in a river, or even a public water pool or water park. Every summer I see on the news that they found Giardia in a public water park somewhere. You can pick them up from walking barefoot. You can pick them up from sitting on a beach. You can pick them up from eating unwashed produce. And I'm saying pretty much I've picked up parasites from all of these methods myself that I know of, that I have confirmation that I had parasites at that time. And the problem with parasites is that our testing is notorious for false negatives. So even if you get tested for parasites, there's a 50-50 chance that it's going to come out negative, and that doesn't mean that you don't have parasites. But when there are parasites in the body, the job of a parasite is to find a host, take up residence, and reproduce and live happily ever after. And unless you address them directly, there's a lot of parasites that will never go away. But meanwhile, your white blood cells, their job is to patrol through the body and look for foreign invaders, usually virus or bacteria, or even toxins, and they see the parasites, and so they send out the defenses, inflammation and heat like fever and antibodies. Maybe parasites could care less, right? It does, none of those things affect a parasite at all. They keep going on their merry way, but the body keeps, or the white blood cells keep seeing these foreign invaders, so you end up in this chronic cycle of inflammation and reactions, and your body is working double time to try to get rid of the foreign invaders and never succeeding.
Interesting. I have a different perspective. I was a parasitologist before I was a doctor. I I think actually the technology has gotten a lot better. This idea that parasites get missed, that might have been true. Now that we have PCR testing, PCR will actually pick up fragments of parasites, will pick up, dead parasites. I test a lot of my patients for, everything. We test them for yeast, bacteria, parasites. I rarely come across them, but I think it's good to at least be aware because you're right. I mean, they are out there, and sometimes it can be a cause of hidden inflammation. So it's always a good idea just to double check, make sure. But yeah, in my practice, I rarely find parasites are the culprit for people. But I imagine depending on where you live in the world, again, if you live around a lake, and I've seen people who there's a lot of pathogens that you can get in and around lakes and rivers and more stagnant kind of water. So if you live in those kind of areas, might be different than if you live near the ocean where the salt water kills all sorts of things. So it's kind of good to know what's in your local environment.
So I was on a beach a couple years ago, and I was helping to relocate some sea turtle eggs that had been laid overnight with the hotel's naturalist who was in charge of that, and we had to relocate them from a walking area to a place further up the beach. And while I was doing that and helping dig the hole and everything for the eggs, I must have sat on some larvae, parasitic larvae, because when I came home for the next 6 weeks, I thought I just had like a big insect bite right on the cheek of my rear end, and it wouldn't go away. And I finally took a mirror and I could see the pathway of the larvae as they had moved underneath my skin just from sitting on a beach.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because they've actually been studying using parasites therapeutically for MS and other autoimmune diseases. And this idea is, again, if you look at parts of the world where parasites are endemic, autoimmune disease virtually doesn't exist. If you go to most parts of Africa and a lot of third world countries where, again, they got a fairly high parasitic burden, you don't hear about lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, MS. Again, it's virtually non-existent. So there's this idea that our interaction with at least some parasites in nature are probably good for us to a certain degree because they help modulate our immune system. And of course, certainly in Western society, where we do so much of the food that we never want anyone to ever get sick ever, we irradiate the food, we triple wash, we process. And by eliminating all these parasites from just the things we would get through naturally, it seems that that has changed the way our immune system interacts with other things, and maybe at least in part of what leads to these different autoimmune problems.
I follow those studies that they're doing where they're intentionally infecting people with parasites, and I'm actually horrified because if you have had a parasite and you have struggled to rid yourself of it, it's excruciating to live with parasitic infection. Having been diagnosed and confirmed with at least 7 times, when I returned from Asia in 1998, I was very sick, and I went and I had my stool tested, and the CDC actually picked up the phone and called me, and they said, "We found 5 parasites in your stool.
Wow.
Where have you been? Is there an outbreak of something in Colorado where you live?" And I said, "No, I've been in Asia." But it is not fun to have parasites. It's quite debilitating. I'd actually rather have MS than parasites.
Well, it's interesting. I have a colleague who's very much into the therapeutic parasites, and again, they use different types of hookworms. And but the thing I really don't like, and I agree, is that you have to keep doing it. It's not like you do it once or twice and that resets your immune system. The benefit only lasts for a relatively short period of time, a matter of months, and you have to keep reinfecting yourself. And the process itself, like I said, isn't very pleasant. So, yeah, I'm not a big fan. Dr. William Parker, who was a researcher at Duke at the time, was looking at HDCs, which is a rat tapeworm, which is completely innocuous to humans. It doesn't cause really infection in humans. And I tried it myself for about a year and a half. I never really found any benefit to it. But the idea behind it made sense because we naturally ingest HDCs in wheat products and grain products. It's from the grain beetle. Again, it's not toxic to humans, but we would ingest it, and maybe that was having some role in modulating the immune system. But again, I tried it personally. I tried it with a handful of other patients. I never really saw nothing negative, just nothing really terribly positive. And it's kind of expensive because you got doctors who basically have little farms where they grow their HDCs, and it can be kind of expensive for folks. So again, I think there's something to the role of parasites in modulating our immune system. But yeah, I'm not sure I'm in the camp of intentionally infecting ourselves to achieve that. I think there's a lot of other things we can do to have better health.
Yes. There have been times in my life when I've had parasites that has taken 20, 30 pounds off of me in not a healthy way, right? Because not being able to keep anything in is not good because you're just feeding the parasites, not yourself. So what do you see are some of the overlooked causes of MS?
Well, we said we covered diet. I think the gut microbiome, of course, that's everything. I think toxicity is another big overlooked factor. Mold, mycotoxins. We've got a lot of research on the role of mycotoxins and how they can be causes of MS as well as contributors. And I've shared on the podcast before. I was working in an office in California for a decade that we found out had terrible toxic mold, and that was a time where I did notice that my health was declining. So we've moved out of that office, but we've found that construction, certainly here in Southern California, is mostly pretty terrible, and a lot of these buildings leak. They have mold issues, so it's a really challenging piece for a lot of people to get around because finding a space, home, school, work, wherever you spend time that's free of mold and mycotoxins can be really, really tough.
Yes. I also think that a lot of the things that we kind of use without thinking too hard about them. One of the things I think contributed to my own issues was aspartame.
Mm,
I was a huge
yeah.
aspartame addict. I was a child in the 80s, and I really bought into the whole concept of better living through chemistry. And as I mentioned, Diet Coke was one of my staple foods, but I also used 3 packets of Equal in my morning coffee every day. I was all over aspartame. And then when I was diagnosed with MS and I started to learn about aspartame toxicity, that was revelation to me because I had only been taught in the 80s that low fat, low calorie, that was better for you than any other options that you could have, which I think is absolutely backward now.
Absolutely. Well, I can remember, we're probably about the same age, and I remember, everything had, well, I mean, a lot of things had sweetener, had sugar, cane sugar. But I look back at the time, I mean, kids weren't chronically sick, kids weren't fat, kids didn't have metabolic issues, kids didn't have these things. And I mean, I recall we had a decent amount of sugar in a lot of things. It was in the cereal, it was in the stuff we drank. So it wasn't like we rarely had it. We had quite a bit of it. And at some point, sugar got demonized of being the cause of all these health issues. So then they started switching over to aspartame and all these other artificial sweeteners. And of course, corn syrup was probably the biggest one. And
Right.
we've now come to learn that, corn syrup is highly addictive. And we know that food manufacturers intentionally put it in food to get you hooked on it. And as we shifted away from just using real raw organic cane sugar and all these other artificial things, that's when we started to see chronic illness go up, obesity go up, metabolic syndrome. So certainly that is another big culprit, I think, behind a lot of autoimmune diseases.
I think so too. And we even maybe you should look at high fructose corn syrup. more than even just regular corn syrup because they add this fructose, and it's not fructose that is like derived from an apple. It's not natural. It's a chemical mimicry of a natural substance to make it even sweeter. Did you ever watch Breaking Bad?
I didn't. Yeah.
There was a scene in the final season of it where they were in a Asian food manufacturing place, and the executive, his job that day was to test the dipping sauces for the chicken nuggets. And they were presenting him the dipping sauces, and they're like, well, here's this dipping sauce, and then here's this one for the US market. It's significantly sweeter, much more high fructose corn syrup because we have been trained to appreciate or to expect our food to be hyper sweetened, hyper colored, right? Where did
Yeah.
all of this food coloring come from? Why do we think our food needs to be neon?
Well, you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of things that we do with our food supply that's banned in the EU. It's banned in most of the world. Again, I'm hoping and again, I think slowly we're starting to see some of these things change. I'm seeing some of the big food manufacturers are at least coming out publicly and saying, we're going to get away from using artificial dye. Where, again, if you buy M&Ms in the United States, it's a completely different product than M&Ms in the EU. And I'm like, well, if you can make a cleaner, safer candy product there, why can't you do it here? And I'm sure it's just a cost thing. It's probably cheaper to use the artificial stuff than to use some of the natural stuff. But why not have better offerings for the public? So again, I'm optimistic that we'll start to see a change in the American food supply because I think if we can really commit to that as a country, we will see dramatic changes in the overall health of Americans.
I completely agree, and I hope it comes to pass. Our food lobbies are so powerful in this country, and there's just a lot of money going into Congress, into lobbyists trying to keep those kinds of regulations out of our food supply. I mean, remember the whole fight against even labeling genetically modified foods?
Oh, yeah. Well, they had an initiative here in California some years ago where, again, they wanted to force, all food products that were genetically modified to put a label on that. And of course, in California, of all places, you would think this would be the state be like, yes, we want that. And it got shot down. It didn't pass. The food lobby came in and managed to convince people that this was a bad idea. I'm like, why is being aware of genetically modified foods a bad idea? Well, they know why, because if people see that label, they're probably not going to buy it. They will buy it when they don't know it's genetically modified, but if they do, they will probably make other choices.
Yes, and now they have brought the label in, but it now looks happy and sunshiny. Have you seen that? Genetically modified.
Yeah.
They don't call it genetically modified. What do they call it? Enhanced or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's all sunshine and sun rays going out, looking very happy to try to fool people because we're not taught about food safety in this way as we're growing up. It's not something that's in our educational system. Oftentimes, the food that we even serve in schools, and I'm going to say hospitals too, is really appalling. I mean, whoever decided that the best thing to give to a patient after surgery was Jello?
Yeah, it's true. Well, I think this is important for people tuning in to learn to be a savvy consumer, especially when you're at the grocery store and shopping, learning how to read labels, learning all the code words. I mean, corn syrup, I think, is probably the most guilty because it's dextrin, maltodextrin, fructose, glucose, sorbitol, maltitol. If you see an artificial sweetener, there's a high probability it's corn derived and it carries all the characteristics of corn syrup. So looking for things that are, if you're going to have something that's sweetened, at least sweetened with something natural. It's a much better option. And the good news is too, again, some of the largest suppliers of, I'll say, good clean food is not Whole Foods anymore. It's Costco and Target and all these other places that a lot of people shop that I think it's made it a lot more affordable for people. There's some really great frozen foods that are organic, if the fresh stuff is a little bit more pricey. So I think we have a lot of options in this country to make better food choices for you and the whole family.
I agree. And in fact, so that became my driving force was to try to find a way to make healthier food, healthier meals for myself and my family on a regular basis. Because when I first was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis and learning about whole foods versus processed foods, I very quickly realized after taking cooking classes and watching the Food Network that living off a whole foods based diet was very labor and time intensive. And as you know, with MS, fatigue is a very real issue. So spending hours in the kitchen and then hours cleaning up after a meal was really unappealing and not feasible so much. And that's what I was looking for when uh, I call myself an accidental inventor, when I stumbled across my cooking method. So I was watching late night TV one night with my husband when we were first married, and we didn't have cable TV at the time because that was expensive. So
Yeah.
there were three channels or four channels on TV, and one of the only things that was on was this infomercial, and this man was saying, "Look, I can make this whole meal in this one countertop appliance," and he puts in dry rice and a can of tomatoes, and then he puts a metal grate over it, like a barbecue grill type grate, and then he puts chicken breasts on top of that, and then another metal grate, and then brownies on top of that, covers the whole thing with a dome, plugs it in, and turns it on. And I thought, wow, that is brilliant. I want to be able to make my entire meal in one appliance or one utensil, but I don't have that countertop appliance, and I don't have the money to buy it, and I don't have any of those metal grates, and I don't really care about the brownies. So I went over to my oven, and I had a cast iron Dutch oven that we had recently received as a wedding gift. And I thought, well, maybe if I just do kind of something similar to what he was doing on the commercial, that I can make a whole foods based meal. And so I cranked up my oven to 450 degrees, which, if you know anything about cooking, you can tell what a novice I was, because you only cook what breads and pizza at 450
Yeah.
degrees. But I didn't know. And I thought that probably that plug in electrical appliance that man was using went pretty hot because it seemed like it cooked pretty quickly. So I didn't know, but I went to my freezer and I pulled out some frozen fish fillets, and I had some vegetables and some herbs, and I put them all into this cast iron Dutch oven, put the lid on it, and put it in a 450-degree oven. And in about half an hour, it just started to smell like dinner. And that became the way that we cooked most nights. And I didn't really think much of it until my college roommate came to visit for a week. And at the end of the week, she said, "Will you please teach me to cook like you cook?" And I looked at her and I said, "Well, you've seen me do it. I really just throw things into the cast iron Dutch oven and put it in my hot oven. It's not that hard." And she said, "Well, I think there's a little bit more to it." And I thought, okay, so that's when I sat down and I wrote it all out in what I first considered to be an instructional guide, but turned into a full-on cookbook. And now I've sold more than 60,000 copies of my cookbook that features this cooking method, Glorious One Pot Meals. And I've received two patents on this because, as it turns out, the patent office spent 2 or 3 years looking for records of anyone else actually using this specific cooking method to prepare foods, and were unable to find any evidence.
Oh, that's great. You're right. It's. I like the simplicity of it. I'm wondering, was that Ronco by chance that had the late night commercial?
I don't, it could have been, right? Ronco was all over late night infomercials.
Back in the day, Ronco had everything. But yeah, you're right. You know, with MS and other autoimmune and really other chronic illness, when you're exhausted and tired, the thought of doing chopping your broccoli and your vegetables and cooking them, sautéing them, and then I got to cook the meat and this and that, it can be very overwhelming when you just want simple. So I love the idea of having something very simple, straightforward. So we'll definitely drop a link to your cookbook in the show notes so that people can check that out. And but that's really interesting that that was all prompted by a late night infomercial for some
You
other
never,
random
right?
product.
You never know where inspiration is going to come. And it turned out to be a great method, because it's not stews that it comes out with, because that would be slow cooking, right?
Right.
This is quick, in half an hour, 45 minutes, dinner's ready. So the actual, each ingredient maintains its integrity. You don't stir during the process. You never
Yeah.
touch it once it goes in the oven. So when you pull it out, you can actually pull everything out with tongs. And when my kids were little, I used to serve everything on like segmented trays. You can't even tell it was touching each other.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, before we close out, I do want to hear from you, for someone who's brand new to this, just got a diagnosis of MS, just diagnosis of another autoimmune. What's your advice of like, hey, where do you start in this process?
I really think that the first place to start is by reading labels and trying to clean up what you're eating. And then seek out help with experts, people who've been through it. I have spent the last 25, 26, 27 years researching, trying things, looking at what might be the best things for my body. And you have spent decades as well looking for this. So you can really shorten that timeline for yourself by working with someone who understands what's going on.
Absolutely. A little good guidance goes a long way.
A little good guidance goes a long way. And I have a program in my Inflammation Academy called Inflammation Sleuth that is exactly that, that you can access from anywhere in the world. It's really just an educational introduction to all of the hidden triggers in our world that can be causing the inflammation in your body, and then how to start removing them and reducing the variables so you can really drill down to what could be causing your issues. Are they mycotoxins? Is it food issues? Is it parasites? What is it?
Great. Well, we'll drop a link for that as well. That's on your website?
Yes, it's in the Inflammation Academy.
Great. So we will drop a link for both the program and the cookbook. And again, I appreciate you spending time. This has been really helpful information. Again, I always appreciate you sharing your own personal story. I know it's sometimes nice for people to hear, for people who've actually been through it, and being able to share your story. And the fact that you're thriving and doing great certainly is an inspiration to everybody who's listening.
I love to say I'm still in heels and I'm not on wheels. And here I am, 27 years past my diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. So there is hope out there. And I hope no one else has a doctor that is as dour as mine was with the prognosis for their lives, because even if something is incurable, it doesn't mean that you can't still live a really good life.
Well, again, I appreciate you spending time, and thank you so much for sharing all this great information.
Thank you. And yes, if anybody wants to learn more about any of this, really everything is through my website at elizabethyarnell.com.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.